brief but comprehensive introduction. May I know the level of participation and the participants, whether they are diplomats, civil servants, or the practitioners of diplomacy? If the participants are listening and watching me, I would be rather happy to have a two-way communication rather than a monologue, like old style of lecturing. This will be focusing more on you because I believe in two-way communication. It will let us learn from each other. Basically, economic diplomacy per se is a new type or kind of diplomacy which is recently in vogue in diplomatic conversations. But it is not new, actually. Indeed, the beginning of diplomacy started for economic gains or trade purposes, but it was called as a traditional diplomacy. Even in ancient states, there was a trade diplomacy, trade missions. And once the states, modern states were established, there were permanent diplomatic missions. And embassies preceded by the consulates. They were consulates, and consulates were primarily for trade, supporting and potentiating their traders and trade missions. So that's why the diplomacy is basically the primary job of diplomatic missions, even before this modern economic diplomacy, was to promote the country's trade and economic relations with other countries and states. So if you are listening to me, may I know if somebody can share his or her basic knowledge and information that what they understand about economic diplomacy. All more or less all these points are parts of economic diplomacy, because as I was mentioning that humans have used diplomacy since the beginning of the human race. It is not new, because when there was a tribal system, the tribes negotiating their settlement of their pastures, their cultivable land, forest, and all those disputed things like water resources, these were done through negotiation. That was the primary, basic, crude type of diplomacy, which was applied by the humans in the beginning of human race. And when small little states took place of tribal societies, again, the scope of diplomacy was little bit extensive. It was extended, and states started negotiating with each other to avoid the war, because diplomacy is called as the first line of defense. It is said that when diplomacy fails, war begins, and diplomacy starts, war ends. So diplomats are basically considered to be the people who stop wars, end the wars, or avoid the wars. So that was the primary concept during the initial stages of modern states. And humans use the best of their minds as diplomats to avoid these wars and complement each other, support each other to achieve some sort of stability in the region and get economic benefits of that extended period of peace. because peace was not being achieved at that time. Whichever state was getting power, trying to gain more territory and more economic benefits out of those resources which were uh, in the possession of smaller states. The 16th century, when proper diplomatic missions were sent to different countries. For example, when there was Ottoman Empire, before that, diplomacy was actually practiced by two empires, Roman Empire and Persian Empire. The Persian and Roman diplomats were sent to each other's states very frequently, and even there's historical evidence that permanent missions were established by these two empires. But smaller states were also sending not permanent missions, but temporary missions to these empires. Now, what was the role of smaller states? When these were two big empires, those two smaller states were actually allied states with these two empires. So they sent their diplomatic missions to avoid a wars or occupation of their territories by one or other empire. So that was the main purpose of sending those diplomatic missions. But the permanent diplomatic missions between Roman and Persian empires was basically to avoid war and have trade links, trade caravans, peace and stability will achieve greater trade integration between two empires. So that was the purpose of those trade missions, or we say consulates, before these modern consulates which took place in 15th and 16th century, especially British Empire and Elizabeth I's time, they started it, sending missions to various countries. And Ottomans were receiving those missions in the time of uh, Suleiman the Magnificent, Suleiman the Lawgiver, which is considered to be the most important sultan in the history of Ottomans, who has uh, given the constitution, per se, we can say, of Turkish Empire, and actually organize the rules and regulations of the empire. So that's why it is called Suleiman the Lawgiver. So all those laws which were practiced but not written, in some provinces they were practiced, in other provinces they were not. So he has actually documented those rules and imposed across the empire. So during that time, it is recorded that many missions were received in Istanbul. And when Elizabeth I took power in England, and she was sending missions, one of the missions was sent to Istanbul as well. And certain missions were sent to Mughal India by the British, France, and many other European countries. All of those missions were trade missions. And then we can see there are certain other types of diplomacy. So this was just an overview that diplomatic practice started. The first purpose was to avoid the war, and second was to protect the trade caravans and trading between states. So now I stop here. If you have any question regarding this intro, you can raise the question. I'm saying that if anyone has any question regarding my this introduction to diplomacy, because we'll be now discussing other types of diplomacy. Now, there are basically, if you see, two types of diplomatic practices. One is traditional diplomacy, which is between two countries, and those traditional diplomatic practices involve uh, doing all their best to have better bilateral relations. What we say, we are enjoying best brotherly relations between such and such a state and my sending country. For example, we use that. But if we see those best relations, are they translated into economic relations? We see there's very negligible trade between those states having best relations. So this traditional diplomacy has created best relations, means they support each other on multilateral forums, they support each other's ideas, they support each other's candidature on multilateral or regional forums, but there's no trade. There's no interaction between the trading community of two countries or between the professionals of two countries, or there's no flow of tourists coming and going from these two countries. So this is called a traditional diplomacy. Traditional diplomacy is not focusing on economic ties, trade improvements, results corresponding to relations in the shape of figures. For example, if you see two countries, two having trade of billions, of China is trading with India, and their trade volume is more than $100 billion. China is trading with Japan. Again, figures are going beyond triple digit. China is trading with the USA, and it is hundreds of billions of dollars. But now, why I deliberately gave these three examples. China and all three countries are otherwise, traditionally speaking, in traditional diplomacy, not enjoying the best relations. As we say that we have excellent brotherly relations with Niger. Now, if you'll ask me, what is trade volume between Niger and Pakistan? And what is the trade volume between Niger and that country which is not enjoying excellent brotherly relations with Niger? If I say Pakistan has a trade volume of say $30,000, it's not a figure which is actual. I'm just saying example. And the country which is not enjoying excellent brotherly relations, the Niger, is having a trade of $100 million. So in your opinion, which country is closer to Niger, Pakistan or that country? Although we have $45 million trade with Niger, it is not 30,000, because we have worked, and my focus is actually on economic diplomacy. So now, yes, somebody is raising hands, please allow him or her. But Pakistan is always not interested in aid diplomacy. Sometimes Pakistan is also giving aid. You will be very surprised to know that we are providing aid to many African countries, including Niger. We have given aid to Niger also, and regularly we are giving. So it is traditionally between countries. At one or other point, we receive, and some point we also give aid to our friendly countries in need. For example, in time of a drought in 2020, we have provided food aid to Niger. We have also provided food aid to Niger in 2015, a shipload of rice, almost $15 million. So, isn't it surprising? You must be thinking that Pakistan is only receiving. No, Pakistan also giving. I'm giving just example of my own country where I'm posted, but there are 24 countries where we provide aid to them. So, and Pakistan is also receiving aid from friendly countries. But this is a soft power. Giving aid means you have some leverage. The countries which are providing aid to Pakistan, objectives as well. Nothing is free diplomatic relationship. Even during your own personal relationship to neighbors, to friends, to relatives, when you give something, sometimes it is not in kind that when you are giving some gift, so you expect that at least same value gift should be returned to you. No, it is not. Sometimes it is support. Your relative in some matters should support you because you have been offering gifts, you have been offering something in kind, and you have been supporting. So that support, maybe it is a moral support, it is required. So in the relationship between countries, it also matters that your viewpoint, your disputes with other states, your friendly countries support, or sometime offer mediation, create conducive environment so that you are brought on the table and negotiate and settle your issues. So there are so many things which you give and you also get in return. It is not always same that you receive money and you return money. But the aid which you are also saying, you always read in the stories, news stories, that such and such country got billions in aid. Most of that aid is not free. It is actually loan. Sometimes it is a loan which is more than the commercial rate. So if you have been following many countries and if you have been reading Economist or Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs magazines or Diplomat magazine, you might be aware about the term date trip, a term which is uh, very much used during last 2 3 years by certain countries, that such and such country is using loan is debt trap, trapping those countries. We are now just discussing certain types of diplomacy, and we will be coming one by one on all these issues like uh, education tourism, health tourism, tourism, and trade, foreign direct investment, aid. What is the difference between grant and types of aids, and what is the uh, work of economic diplomat, how they gather information and how they provide uh, advice to their manufacturers, their exporters. So all these things we will be discussing later on. And the relationship between Russia and Pakistan, uh, there's a lot of potential to work together and benefit from each other's potentials. It will be mutually complementary. It is not like we are not competitors actually. We can complement each other. For example, if Russia has more energy, Pakistan needs energy. We can get energy. And if Russia needs certain products like textile, like rice, uh, like fruits, like processed food, we can provide that, ready-made garments, and many other things, surgicals, sporting goods. So we can provide to Russia. So these are mutually complementary things. We will be discussing later on, but at this stage we are discussing different types of diplomacy so that it should be clear in your mind that how economic diplomacy is different from other types of diplomacies. Like there's also uh, a lot of discussion about public diplomacy, how public diplomacy is different than economic diplomacy, and how it is supportive to economic diplomacy, how digital economic diplomacy is working, and how conference diplomacy is working. And there were other type of diplomacy you might have read in the books. Gunboat diplomacy. What was gunboat diplomacy? Those were coercive tactics used by certain empires to subjugate these states, to allow their traders to sell those contraband items, those items which were not allowed in those countries. So those countries used gunboat, means force, and the countries were forced to sign the agreement and allow those items. The classical example is opium trade. You know opium trade? China has banned opium, and British was selling, British Empire was the largest trader of opium. So they imposed war, first war on China, 1839. And China was forced to sign an agreement, allow British to sell opium in China. Again, China banned the opium. So there was second opium war in 1860. China was defeated, Hong Kong and other territories were taken by British, and China signed an agreement. So opium was sent to China. That's why you might have heard in the history, read in the history, that Chinese were called as opium eaters. And in West, it was said, these opium eaters will fight with us. These opium eaters will develop. These opium eat. So this became one of the examples. They gave that opium eaters will do nothing. And now the same nation, opium eaters nation, is now factory of the world. What made it a factory of world? It is economic diplomacy. But initially, what made them opium eaters? That was gunboat diplomacy. They were forced, they were subjugated to sign those treaties which were not in their favor. So such diplomatic tactics were used there. Now it is no more time of using disproportionate force to occupy the world, like the British occupied, France occupied, the country where I'm sitting, it was occupied by France. So most of Africa, most of Asia, and many in Europe and Americas, all these countries were occupied by certain empires. So they were using that gunboat diplomacy force. And even those nominally independent states, they were under certain obligation to toe the line of their paramount power. They were considered as peripheral states. So major states means the power which was controlling that state was dictating the diplomatic relations. Now even you see certain countries cannot go beyond the lines drawn by certain powerful countries, they play within that circle. It means their diplomatic policy, diplomatic practice is not completely free. Even today, although gunboat diplomacy has uh, is now it is the story of past, but still pressures, that pressure could be economic pressure, sanctions, like you see sanction, it one of the tools we will be discussing in detail. So I was discussing before your question, uh, date trip. What is date trip? Certain examples you have read in the newspapers and the magazines like Diplomat, Foreign Affairs, Economist, and many other local and regional magazines, diplomatic magazines. The classical example they quote is Sri Lanka. They say Sri Lanka was purposely selected and given loan which was beyond its capacity to serve, to return. So what happened? They have to give control of their port and airport in Hambantota. It's a classical example. Hambantota port in Sri Lanka was built by the previous government in Sri Lanka, considering, thinking that there'll be lot of trade and rush of ships and tourism as well. So there are a lot of development, but it was not considered to be a wise decision. Economists gave it minus marks, not even zero. Economically speaking, not this is I'm not talking about uh, diplomatically. Diplomatically, that could be a different, because there are two views, two camps. One is the Western camp that is considering it a dead trap. Other is the Eastern camp, like we say North and South discussions. So in Western camp, it is called as the dead trap. But in Eastern camp, it is not considered so, because Chinese are not going to occupy physically any country like these Western countries did for centuries. We have not witnessed or observed that China has gone to occupy any country. Have you observed that? No, China didn't occupy any country. So that is a different story altogether and different interpretations. But debt trap is also a reality. Why it is reality? Because when economic diplomats are not working according to their mandate, they are not providing wise advice to their sending state on the loans the state is obtaining from various states. Because and you remember that I said there are three types of loans which state get. One is loan from multilateral organizations like World Bank, IMF, and consortiums, Paris Group, London Group, like that. And the other loan is advanced by the countries, like China gives loan to Pakistan or Niger. Russia gives loan to Central Asian countries. So this is bilateral loan. And third loan is by the regional banks like Islamic Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank. So these are types of loans which states get to improve their economic conditions and to proceed with their projects which can potentiate their economic development, which create conducive environment, which create infrastructure for fast track development of that particular country. But then here comes the role of economic diplomat to advise the sending country that whether this loan and its conditions are appropriate, favorable to the country, or in long run, they will create a problem. So if that advice is already tendered and country's leadership has not acted upon it, because of course, a diplomat only advice, it is non-binding advice. Decision is always taken by the leadership, not by diplomats. So diplomat's role has finished. But if he has failed to provide the same advice, then it is his failure. So in economic diplomacy, when we are talking about, as we have discussed today, various types of diplomacy, as I said, public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is also widely practiced. Like you are posted in Islamabad, you are arranging cultural show. Now, some diplomats say there's another type of diplomacy, that is cultural diplomacy. Certain countries, they only project their cultures. That is said culture diplomacy. But as far as my understanding is concerned, culture is part of public diplomacy. Like your embassy arranging cultural show, projecting different cultures within your country, colors and cultures in your country. For example, your embassy is arranging art show. It's another event of public diplomacy. You are arranging a walk, for example, for what? As you have mentioned, climate change. Your embassy is arranging walk for the awareness about climate change. It's a public diplomacy. You are having a seminar on intellectual property rights. It's a public diplomacy. Your ambassador or one of your diplomats going to a university to lecture. It's part of public diplomacy. You are going to address Islamabad chamber, Lahore chamber, Karachi, Hyderabad chamber. It's public diplomacy. But now, how public diplomacy will be supporting economic diplomacy, that we will be discussing in the incoming lectures. Today it was an introductory thing, so that you have clear concept about various types of diplomacy. Diplomacy is not only between countries. Multilateral diplomacy, you see, UN is a major forum where multilateral diplomacy is practiced. They are regional organizations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and between your CIS, Commonwealth, OIC, ASEAN. So they are regional EU, regional organizations where multilateral diplomacy is being practiced. In Africa, it is AU. African Union, ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. So these are all multilateral diplomatic forums. So two major kinds are bilateral and multilateral diplomacies. But within that, again, comes these public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, digital diplomacy, economic diplomacy. And there's one other type of diplomacy also, that is dollar diplomacy. Using dollar for the diplomatic gain for a particular state. So that was called as dollar diplomacy. It has been played very, very extensively, but now its role is going down because sorry, certain countries are now having currency baskets. They are not trading only in one currency, that is dollar. So they are using more than one currencies. So that has actually reduced that much impact of dollar. So dollar diplomacy was at one time used extensively. So these are certain things which we discussed today. We have this discussion in our coming lectures in detail, that what role they have to play. But briefly, I'm replying your question. Yes, diplomats should be extrovert. They should reach out to exporters, business people, chambers, organizations, and inform them about trade opportunities in their respective countries, sending states. Because information is rather incomplete with the organizations or companies which are not doing much of the trade with, for example, with Russia or Central Asian countries, although they are nearby Pakistan. But our trade is very, very small with them as compared to faraway states. So it is the role of embassies in Islamabad to provide appropriate information to the buyers and sellers to about their respective countries. Similarly, it is the role of our embassies in those countries, in Central Asia, Russia, uh, to provide appropriate information to the buyers and sellers of that country so that they interact with each other. Not only provide information, but contacts. Because sometimes we provide information, but when buyer wants to buy something, they don't find a certified seller. So they come back again to embassy. So it is better to provide them contacts that this is a list of sellers in my country, for example, about basmati rice, for leather garments, for fabrics, for footwear, surgicals, sports material. Similarly, the sending state, for example, if somebody is from Russia, from Iran, from uh, Kazakhstan, they will provide the information about their sellers in various goods and services, like agriculture technology. They have equipments, they have machinery, they have energy equipments, related products. So they will provide not only the information, but the contacts, so that easily buyers can contact them and start doing something. So that is the duty of trade mission or economic development. We will be discussing in detail that how step by step we can do, because it is not like 2 plus 2 4. It is not as easy as it is thought, because missions require support from sending state, streamlining everything, cooperation of different line ministries. If I send some proposal and it is killed by TDAP or Commerce Ministry, it will not work. If I send a proposal to Ministry of Health for health tourism, they don't support. It will not work. For example, I send proposal for admitting students in higher education, and higher education ministry doesn't support me. It will not work. So it will not just singular action of a diplomat only. It is a joint action, collaborative action. So line ministries have to support mission. We will discuss that how they will support and get the desired results if economic diplomacy is properly practiced. Despite not having, as I gave you example of China, India, China, Japan, China, Taiwan, China, USA, they are having greater trade relations. Even if we don't have based bilateral relations, we can have best trade relations. And in return, those trade relations will minimize our antagonism. It depends on economic diplomat, how far he or she is supporting to bring two countries closer trade-wise, economic integration-wise, increasing the trade volume, increasing the interaction between the trading communities of two countries. That will influence at a greater length to reduce that gap which you are observing today. At later stage, we will be discussing it in detail. But briefly, as you have raised the question, I am giving you a short answer that the smaller states, weaker states per se, can also gain a lot from economic diplomacy by keeping themselves as low profile in other affairs. You understand, other affairs, only focusing on trade. They can gain lot from trading. So we will be discussing in detail how they can keep other issues silent or having their own opinions, not of course not giving up their rights or their opinions, their claims, but at the same time fast tracking economic relations, economic through economic diplomacy. So we will be discussing the means how in detail in next chapters. This was today just an introductory chapter. We have given overview, but it is not difficult. It is not impossible that smaller state cannot gain from economic diplomacy. Every state can gain. This is not zero-sum game, because economic diplomacy is different from gunboat diplomacy. That powerful countries were forcing weaker countries to buy, and they were forcing weaker countries to shut down their industries. For example, British did the same in subcontinent, in Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. The local industries were shut down. When British came in subcontinent, The best cloth was produced in subcontinent. In Pakistan, Thatta near Karachi was producing the best muslin, but the industry was shut down. And these weaker states were forced to buy cloth manufactured in England. But now it is not the time that these powerful states force you to buy there. But of course, there is competition. So small states have to focus on those products where they have advantage, they have expertise, and gain market share. I will be giving you practical examples of smaller, weaker states getting and gaining more share than their size in coming lectures. So you will see how you being posted in Pakistan can get share for your own country and connect two countries economically.